More now on our City News investigation into convict cops, police officers who are convicted of a crime but allowed to keep their jobs. Reading through some of the tribunal hearing decisions that I was able to get my hands on, one interesting aspect stood out, and that is the role, the weight that media coverage of the crime plays in the punishment handed out to the officer. These are some of the police tribunal decisions we've managed to get a hold of, and you may be surprised to learn the weight that media coverage of an officer's conviction plays when they're deciding punishment. They look at mitigating and aggravating factors. In this case, for example, an officer was convicted of assault for kicking with his police boots a suspect in the head. And here the adjudicator writes, "It's unknown to me to what extent the publicity or knowledge of the events is to residents of York Region." In this case, where an officer was convicted of assault, one of three officers who brutally beat a 62-year-old man in the bathroom at a Christmas party. The adjudicator notes that there was a lengthy and highly publicized criminal trial. They even entered a scan of media articles as evidence. In this case, where an officer was convicted of drunk driving and totaling a police car, it was noted that there was no media attention highlighting this conviction. So when you look at the aggravating factor, one of them is, has this made the media? And if it hasn't made the media, that's now seen as a mitigating factor. That surprises me.
I think you need to change that. So if it doesn't catch the editor or the assignment editor, and I think that, that's wrong in some sense because, often we need to report it. We need to share it. It's time to reflect where we're at in society.
Toronto's police union boss has a different take. So does that mean that if the media is not covering each of these stories, then they sort of get off?
No, what that means is quite to the contrary. It's where the media does jump on stories, and at times the media exploits that story, or it's a slow news day or whatever, and that gets to the top of the news. They have to weigh out the impact of how that affects the public confidence and credibility within the service.
Now, obviously, the media coverage is not the only factor when they're deciding what kind of a punishment to hand out to police officers. There are other aggravating and mitigating factors, including the seriousness of the crime, public interest, employment history, deterrence, and the potential for rehabilitation. Now, something the chief said to us yesterday in our story has raised some questions. Our Tammy Sutherland has more on that.
Well, Avery, we did receive comments after your story aired last night.
Let's take it in context. So we're looking at 0.375% of my men and women. So the number is very low. And we know that this is an industry that deals with a lot of stress, and sometimes that stress can turn into unlawful behavior. So you have to take things into consideration as to what the cause is.
That comment from Toronto Police Chief Mark Saunders yesterday about the investigation City News brought you last night. GTHA police officers convicted of criminal wrongdoing, and the vast majority of them keeping their jobs. We've asked the chief for clarification on those comments. We're still waiting for his response, but in the meantime, we wanted to delve a little deeper into the stress that police officers face on a daily basis and what the service is doing to help them cope. Now, we have looked into in the past how PTSD affects officers, but what has the TPS changed since then? Well, we went to them to find out, and they say that the amount of departments that have to see a psychologist every year, mandatory, that has increased and been expanded. They also say that the number of officers who have stepped in for voluntary mental health visits have jumped.
When I first started, sometimes people would walk by my door and not want to make eye contact because I was the psychologist. It's gone from the point where we were seeing maybe one or two people calling our office and booking an appointment in a given month. Now it's 2 and 3 per psychologist, and there are 2 of us working every week who are calling up and saying, "Doc, can I book an appointment? There's something I need to talk about."
Psychological services started with mandatory visits for some of the officers who were in what was determined to be a high-risk unit. That would include places like the Emergency Task Force and child exploitation. And recently, over the years, we've expanded that to include a number of other units across the service. Human trafficking is one of the areas that's being considered, as well as for those who work in forensic identification services.
The service says that psychological help is also being extended to family members of officers, as well as for officers who are dealing with personal problems that have nothing to do with work at all. And those mandatory check-ins every year, they're also being proposed for officers who are suspended while facing criminal charges.